Hi everybody, I'm Henry Badgery and I'm really excited to welcome you back to the 7th episode of Open Source for Business. In this episode we talk with Paul Chen, the manager of open source compliance and enablement at Synopsys. Some of the interesting topics that we'll be diving deep into today include how does an open source audit work and what are some best practices that enterprises should be aware of? We dive deep into the Linux versus Cisco case, which involves licenses and in particular the GPL license. We discuss the different types of licenses and how they work together and in some ways are related. We also go into the topic of security and open source software. Open Source for Business is brought to you by Open Teams, the open source services marketplace where users of open source software can find, vet, and contract with service providers. To show support for this podcast, it would really help if you could please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and let us know what you think. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel to make sure that you don't miss any of our content. Joining me as a host today is Eunice Chen, the VP of Partners at Open Teams. So are you ready? Let's dive right in. Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
Hello. How are you guys?
Very good today. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
So you've been a manager of open source enablement and compliance at Synopsys for around over 5 years now. But before we get into the details of what that role actually entails, I'd really love it if you could take us back and give us an idea of how you got here today.
Yeah, so right after I graduated with a computer science degree, I joined QVinci. It's a small company that's based in Austin, Texas. And then back then I was one of the three software engineer developing applications for them. And then right after that, I jumped to the Microsoft Dynamics AX ERP. I was a software engineer for about 2 to 3 years. And after that, I moved to California, the Bay Area, and then and after one more year, I got hired by Black Duck, which got acquired by Synopsys now. So yeah, it was a fun journey. I mean, overall, it was pretty interesting. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, while we're on the topic, how about you tell us a little bit about what Synopsys is all about?
Yeah. So basically, there are 3 different groups in Synopsys. The first one is the EDA, the electronic design automation, right? And then the second branch is actually the intellectual IP. And our group is actually, they belong to the third one, which is the software integrity group. So we use our software to do services, it's about security. And my team is especially emphasized in open source licensing and compliance.
Nice. That's pretty awesome. And again, we just want to learn more a little bit about your background and really your day-to-day activities as a manager of open source enablement and compliance at Synopsys. Could you tell us a little bit about what that role entails?
Yeah, so I'm actually a people manager. I manage 6 people as of now, and that's probably 30% of my day-to-day job. The other 40%, I would say, I'm always on the customer call with the customers, along with our salespeople. And my job is to answer the technical questions regarding, do they have any concerns regarding the open source audits, or, is there anything that we can help them, or do they have any questions regarding the scope of our audits? So, yeah, and then that's pretty much what my day-to-day job is.
Okay. And I understand that an open source audit, it's a client comes to you, they provide code, and you go through that code and you figure out what's open source, what's not. You figure out the dependencies. That's my basic idea, but I really am curious, what is an open source audit in your perspective, and how does it work?
Yeah, so the first step is to determine the scope of what we will be looking at inside the code base, right? So usually we will have a kickoff call with the customer and to understand more about what they do and what are their products, right? And after that, we need to come to an agreement with the scope, like as far as like what we will be looking at. Usually, what we are interested in is the software application, right? So whatever they develop, that's those source code along with the dependency libraries. So in order to get the full landscape of the open source usage, we will need to be looking at both the source code along with the dependency libraries. So that's basically the scope is, right? So after we get the code, usually customers will upload their code to us, and then before that they will sign an NDA, of course, right? And then within our knowledge base, we call it the knowledge base, but it is just a database, right? So Black Duck, Synopsys, we have been collecting open source components for the past 15 years, and then in our database, we actually have over 2.8 to 3 million open source components.
Wow.
So after we scan the customer's code, and then our software will do a comparison between whatever they have to whatever we have in our database. And then after that, the software will show us as far as like if anything is matching, right? Say today, if there's a small function or a small class that's matching whatever we have in the database, the software will tell the consultants, we call it our auditors, right? And then from there, they will do some research and then determine what the origin of the code is, and also the license and the website, and if there's anything that our customer needs to be aware of, right? So that's the second step, right? So the final step for the open source audit is that we will produce a report to our customers, and then so inside the report there will be based on what we research, right? So say today if we scan the code base, and then inside the code base there are bunch of open source components, right? And basically we will categorize them into 3 different categories. So the first category will be, we call it the reciprocal license category, red flag, right? So in the case that if anything that belongs to copyleft licenses, for example, GPL, LGPL, Sleepy Cat, or Affero GPL, licenses, we will put them in those categories. And the other category is called the permissive licenses category, right? So those are sometimes we will see a lot of interesting licenses. I will give you 2 examples. One, obviously the most common ones are probably the MIT license, the Apache license, and BSD license.
Yeah.
But sometimes you see like a beerware license. Those licenses will ask the users to maybe buy the author a beer, right? So those are the interesting open source license that I see. And the other one, the most interesting one is called do the whatever the F you want license. So nice. That is almost like a public domain, right? So yeah, those are pretty interesting. Yeah.
Okay.
And then after that, customer can utilize the reports and then pinpoint to the areas that they might need to be looking at, right?
Okay. And so who are these clients? Why are they coming to you?
So basically, I would say 80% of the time is during merger and acquisition situation, right? So say today, if you have a larger company that's going to acquire a smaller company, and then usually they're interested in the IP of the smaller company, right? Sometimes they will be worried about, if there's any reciprocal license that they use inside the code base, because back in 2008, I think there was a famous lawsuit between the Free Software Foundation and the Cisco, right? Cisco, at the time, Cisco acquired the Linksys, the router company, and then apparently there were a lot of GPL copyleft source code inside the Linksys software. So at the time, the Free Software Foundation actually demanded Cisco to disclose all the source code.
Wow.
And then right after that, the router, the price of the router dropped drastically, because now everyone knows how to do that, how to write those software, right? So obviously that's the most important thing that people are afraid of, right?
So what happens when licenses don't match or there are compliance issues?
Yeah, so basically inside the report, we will have some recommendations, right? Usually it's basically there are three things that you can do. You can either rewrite it or replace it or remove it, right? Mm-hmm. Rewrite it meaning that if you find anything that's copyleft, you don't want to disclose whatever you modify, you can just take them out altogether and then ask your developers to rewrite the functionality that you want into the software, right? That's the number one. And replace it is you can maybe find other open source components and then replace it with the permissive license and replace it with the copyleft component, right? And the last one is to remove it altogether. Sometimes, we will be asking the developers, hey, do you really need this piece of software or this file inside the code base? And they will say they don't use them. So they can just remove it if that's the case. So what our goal is trying to eliminate the risk altogether, right?
Okay. And what should companies be most aware of, or what's the most important thing when they're undergoing an open source audit? What's the most important thing to consider?
Basically, the first question we ask is surrounding the scope, what we will be looking at. And also we are trying to get an understanding of how they deploy their software, right? In the case that, because every open source licenses has a set of obligations. And then in our database, we have over 2,500 open source licenses. And then they all have different attributions and also obligations that whenever you use it, you need to comply with, right? But in the case that sometimes if you don't ship the software, meaning that you don't package your software and then ship it to the users or customers for them to install on their hardware, you don't need to comply with those obligations, right? So that's the other question that usually I ask is this, do you guys actually ship your software, or is it just a web application that it's deployed in the cloud, right? If that's the case, the users merely interact with the software using a web browser and some sort of web browsers, right?
Yeah.
So that's two things I ask is the scope, what we are looking at, and also the how they deploy their software.
Okay, and I know that a lot of companies are pretty surprised when they find out really how much open source they're consuming and using. So what have you seen, someone who does 600 audits every single year?
Yeah, I would say 90% of the time they're a little surprised of how many open source components are in their software and how many kinds of different licenses are in there, right? And then I would say 73% of the time, we find some sort of red flag, meaning that there are copyleft licenses, for example, Eclipse licenses, Eclipse public licenses, or GPL, LGPL in there, right? So it's very common, right?
Well, I would like to shift gears a bit and dive a bit deeper into something you touched earlier, and that is open source licenses. Can you explain the different types of licenses and how they work?
Yeah, so like I say, I think different licenses have different sets of obligations, right? And then we categorize them into basically two different categories. The first category is called the reciprocal license. So basically inside those reciprocal licenses, the obligation, the most major obligation that we are looking at is that whenever you use the software and you modify the files or you combine your work with the components that you use, you will have to disclose whatever you modify or your work with to the. You need to contribute back to the open source community, right? So that's the first kind of I would say the first category, right? So, but the other category is called like I say, the permissive category. So basically, a lot of them are just you need to give attributions to the users and authors of the code of the origin, right? So every time you use it, when you, for example, if you take your iPhone and then go to the settings and go to the, you will find a lot of legal license documents, and then inside those documents, you will see they're constantly giving the credits to the authors of those open source components.
So are there occasions where there are actually no licenses associated to an open source project?
Yeah, so sometimes when our consultants or / auditors, they're looking at a certain piece of software, sometimes they find that on the web homepage, the authors, they do not specify any license that's associated for this particular component, right? So if the case, usually we mark it as no license, right? And then
Got it.
Awesome. And one thing I want to kind of shift gears a bit and focus on, because I know it's a hot topic and it's definitely something that's becoming more and more important these days, particularly in the open source space. So I'm curious, as someone who's an audit and compliance expert like yourself when it comes to open source, what is your perspective on the issue of security?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So for our reports, we have another product called the open source risk assessment, right? So after we finish an open source audit, usually the report will populate a list of components, open source components that's inside the report. And the risk assessment will actually be looking into the vulnerabilities that each open source component has, or those vulnerabilities that have been reported, right? And then we will populate that list of vulnerabilities to our customers. Awesome. And sometimes I think that's very valuable. For example, there was probably in 2018, 2017, there was a Equifax breach, right? Mm-hmm. So at the time, Equifax was using, the software was using open source component called the Apache Strut. Mm-hmm. And then inside the struts, there was a vulnerability that was reported, but obviously the Equifax, they did not upgrade their open source version, the Apache Struts, to the latest version, and that's why there was a breach there, right? So that is actually, and more customers come to us and trying to ask for the open source risk assessment reports.
Oh, wow. Wow. Well, Paul, it definitely seems like you have a lot of experience in the open source space. What are you the most excited about when you do come to the future of open source software?
Well, I think our job is trying to enable the open source use and ensure that there is no risk in this in the open source usage, right? And then a lot of times I think why do people use open source is because they don't have to reinvent the wheel. A lot of times those open source communities, those developers, they are actually smart developers, and then they have very sophisticated software out there for people to use. As long as you use it with the right usage and then with the right correct license. And then I think that's the beauty of open source. And then we are very excited to be able to help people to do that.
Awesome. Awesome.
That's great. It's definitely so exciting to be part of this growing industry and something which is changing the world and changing the software landscape as we know it. So sadly, that's all we have time for today, folks. But Paul, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So to those of you listening, if you liked what you listened to, or if you saw the video on YouTube too, then please like, subscribe, and also leave a comment. It'll help out a lot. And also leave a review on the podcast if you're listening to us on the podcast. So next episode, we'll be talking with Nithya Ruff, who is the head of open source at Comcast. So stay safe, everyone. Until next time, bye.